Hello, everyone. This is Russ Shafer-Landau's The Fundamentals of Ethics, one of the opening chapters of the book. In fact, I believe it is chapter 1, if I remember right. I'm going to go over the raw content of this chapter in a different lecture, but because this is one of our first readings, I wanted to say a little bit about how to approach reading philosophy and reading philosophy text. I'll do another one of these about when we start getting into actual journal articles. I'll have some specific pointers for those. This is out of a textbook, so it's a little bit different, but there are a few things that generalize across all philosophy, whether it's a textbook, an article, whatever. And for many of you, you probably haven't read any academic philosophy before, so I think that it's appropriate to kind of do a little orientation on that. So the first thing that I'm going to stress about reading this kind of text that may be different for some of the other stuff that you've read, you cannot skim this stuff. If your strategy for reading things is to only, say, read the first sentence or two out of each paragraph and then just move on and clear through this, this is about an 17, 18 page reading. I mean, it says 10 in the PDF, but as you can see, it's one page in the PDF is two actual pages out of the textbook. So if you try to do that, if you try to just breeze through this in 10 or 15 minutes, you're not going to retain the information. For some things, like if you were reading, say a novel in a British literature class where you're going to read like a 250, 300 page book in a week and a half, in that kind of situation, you may wind up needing to skim a little bit just to make the amount of reading you have to do manageable. And in certain instances with textbooks, there's a lot of redundancy and so on that pads the length. But philosophy, the details are super important because a lot of what we're trying to do is appraise the quality of an author's reasoning or trying to unpack complicated concepts. You need to understand the details to be able to either appraise the arguments or fully understand the concepts. So don't skim these readings. Like, actually read through them. It takes a little longer, it's a little slower, but read through them more thoroughly if you want to retain the information. Second thing, right here on the first page, we get our first big definition. It's right here at the bottom of this second paragraph, right? We get a definition of ethics. It says, is the branch of knowledge concerned with answering such questions? Now, what questions are we talking about? Well, it's the questions from the previous sentence, right? So if we are interested instead in what our guiding ideals should be, in what sort of life is worth living, in how we should treat one another, then we must turn to philosophy. Ethics is the branch of knowledge concerned with answering these kinds of questions. So questions about what life is worth living, what the ideal life would be, or what our guiding principles should be, how we should treat other people, etc. Now, the reason I point this out, this is an italicized word. Anytime you see an italicized term, journal article, textbook, online, article or something else, whatever it is, whatever reading I give you, if somebody italicized something, it's important. And whatever notes, whatever your system is that you use, this is something that should make it into them, that should be noted, right? So right at the beginning, this is a chapter kind of introducing you to the fundamentals of ethics. Shafer-Landau is saying, this is my definition of ethics. It's the branch of philosophy, specifically philosophical knowledge, that is concerned with answering these kinds of questions. If we keep going, next page, we get three different areas of ethics, right? We get value theory, normative ethics, and metaethics. And I will tell you right now, the vast majority of what we will do in this class is going to be concerned with normative ethics. The other stuff will come in a little bit, maybe, but it's most of what we're doing is number 2 here in normative ethics. And he's given you a list of like what kinds of philosophical questions are answered in these different areas. So he didn't italicize these, but they're in bold. Again, whatever your note-taking formula is, these are terms that should be noted that you should write down. Here we have the golden rule, which is sort of a kind of more or less universalizable moral norm, right? That idea that you should treat others as you would want to be treated. or some, there are different religions cashed out in different ways, but it appears in almost all of them. Interestingly, he doesn't actually give a definition of the golden rule in this passage. It's noted as a vocabulary term, and I think he has a footnote down here, footnote 1, that would show up in the glossary. This is a generalizable enough term that you could look it up and get a pretty good definition of it. That won't always be the case. In some situations, you'll get terms that you'll see in some of our readings where you need to rely on the definition that the author uses in the context. Don't rely on just putting some of these things into Google and getting the right answer. Now, another note about reading philosophy. So we started out here, the first section heading is called The Lay of the Land, and as you can kind of gather, it's sort of just like a brief overview of what ethics is, what the different areas are. Now we have a new header. It says Skepticism about Ethics. You can gather a lot from chapters and articles from how they're structured based on just the headings and the first few sentences. So Shafer-Landau spends a little bit of time basically addressing, like, what if you're, kind of a moral skeptic about ethical principles and ethical values, and you think that morality doesn't really matter, we're all just out, to pursue our self-interest or things like that. And he addresses that objection. Then he's got another section called Ethical Starting Points, which is where we get into basically a list of kind of generally agreed upon moral principles. These are all in italics. Once again, whatever your note-taking system is, every single one of these little bullet points is probably worth putting into your notes somewhere. And then we get this section on moral reasoning, where we talk a little bit. He talks about what arguments are and how moral arguments proceed. So here we have, it runs on the next page, but you get kind of a definition of what he considers to be an argument and what the composition of arguments are. I'm going to go over that in a separate lecture, so I'm going to just kind of skip over this here. Again, this is just sort of an orientation. I do want to point a couple of things out. Notice that we get some passages here that are indented because they're quotes from other people. These are examples that Shafer-Landau is giving of arguments. So these are the kinds of things that these long quotes, like whatever your note-taking system is, I wouldn't reference the entire quote here, but you should make a note that these are designed to be examples of a certain kind of thing. What sort of thing? Well, they're supposed to be examples of philosophical arguments. And so what Russ probably had in mind when he designed this, and I imagine when he teaches his own material, is he would go through an exercise in class where he would just give people this paragraph and say, all right, let's figure out what the argument is, and then let's evaluate it, or something like that. Here is a more bare bones argument that is not taken from like a quoted passage, but this is what we would call a regimented argument, because it's been the premises of the argument, the supporting ideas, and the conclusion are all kind of isolated on their own lines. So first premise here, first supporting idea, heroin's a drug. Second premise or supporting idea, selling heroin is illegal. And then the conclusion, heroin use is immoral. So a person would be saying, first, look, heroin's a drug, and selling heroin's illegal, therefore heroin use is immoral. This is, as he points out, this is an attempt to make a moral argument. Why is it a moral argument? Because of the conclusion, right? You're making a judgment about something being morally permissible, morally wrong, just or unjust, something like that. Here, the person's saying heroin use is morally wrong. So whatever else we may say about this argument, good or bad, it is a moral argument. It's an attempt to support a moral conclusion through philosophical reasoning. Now, Russ points out this is an invalid argument. Again, I'll come back later to the concept of logical validity in a different article. But when you see indented passages like this or like this, it usually means there's something important that the author is trying to illustrate. So pay attention to the way that things are formatted on the page when you're engaging with this material. See, here we have it again. Now, this isn't an argument. This is his kind of test for how you go about assessing validity, right? So he's got the first two parts here at the bottom of the page, and then the third part right here. Then we've got some more examples of arguments. I'm just going to skip over these because it's more of the same, and like I said, I'm going to go over arguments myself in a separate lecture. Now we come to the final section, which is the role of moral theory in ethical reasoning. Oh, it's not the final one. We have looking ahead, which is about the rest of the book, because this was the first chapter of an entire ethics textbook. Well, we're not going to read the rest of the book, but that you do get, if you read this section, you will get some additional perspective on Shafer-Landau's kind of overall view of ethics. So what are some of the takeaways here? Well, anytime you see an italicized or bolded item, like what we started with here, make a note of that, probably a vocabulary term. If it's not a vocabulary term, it's at least going to be an important concept that you're probably going to want to know. Same goes for bolded things. If you see items in a list, then... Right, so here's a list. I didn't talk about this list. This is a list of different bases that people might form skepticism about ethics. So if you're taking notes about that section on skepticism about ethics, maybe just jot down a brief phrase or description of each of these particular reasons. Same thing with all these ethical starting points. Like, you're going to want to know these, or at least know. There's quite a few on this list. Let's see, how many have we got? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12. 11 and 12. That might be too many to just commit to memory, but they're also all very short, right? Like, agony is bad. Self-interest isn't the only ethical consideration. Equals ought to be treated equally. This doesn't take a lot of time to write down. You might not be able to commit them all to memory, but these are going to wind up being fairly important. A lot of these ethical starting points will recur at some point in our class in some form or another. Not all of them, but quite a few of them. So if you see anything that's in a list like this, either make a note of all the listed items or note the general phenomena that the listed items are supposed to represent. So like I said, here, you've got example of an argument, example of an argument, example of an argument. You don't need to write these particular arguments down, just be able to recognize, like, hey, what are the essential features of all of these things? Whether an argument is presented in paragraph form or whether it's presented in this kind of, regimented, streamlined form. What are the ingredients of an argument? Well, they got to have, a concluding idea of some sort, and they've got to have some premises that are designed to offer support for that concluding idea. And the other big thing I pointed out is, pay attention to the section headings, because they help. Like, every single one of these little individual sections will have some kind of specific goal that the author's trying to express to you, whatever it is. So the main purpose of this lay of the land thing was basically just trying to give you an idea of what ethics looks like. The skepticism about ethics section is, hey, well, here's one objection you might have to the practice of ethics. Maybe you're skeptical or a skeptic about moral principles. Here's my response to you. How do we get ethics off the ground? Here's a list of ethical starting points for doing that. How do we engage in moral reasoning? Well, here's what an argument is. Here's how we separate good arguments from bad arguments. Here are some examples of arguments, etc., right? So structurally, each section, and this will be true of papers that you read later that are journal articles, every individual section will have some kind of key point that the author's trying to make. If it's a paper where they're trying to make some kind of an argument, then it will almost always be like a piece of that argument. It will be an attempt to support one particular premise in a large argument, or address a specific objection or something like that. So pay attention to the headings, because they'll help you a lot with the organizational scheme. Not all of our, the last thing I'll point out, not all of our readings will have these, but this reading, because it comes from a textbook, does have discussion questions. So if you want to review, like, how well you understood this, like, think about how you would answer these kinds of questions. Think about, what were the main takeaways from these different sections that I read. Here, that's kind of nice that there's basically one set of discussion questions for each of the 5 main sections of this chapter. If you could answer all of these discussion questions effectively, you know everything there really is to know of great consequence from this particular reading. So I hope this gives you a little bit of information on how to kind of approach reading philosophy. Remember, don't just skim through these, because if you do that and you miss out on the details, you're not going to have a clue how the author... You might be able to understand what the author's main points that they were trying to establish were, but you won't know how they got from point A to point B, or how they responded to an objection to point C or something like that. And when we get later on in the course where we're trying to evaluate how plausible an author's reasoning is, you're going to need to be able to understand the details. So early on here, these first 2-3 weeks where we're kind of setting the stage for that, don't get into bad habits. Don't get into a habit of just breezing through the reading material. It's not going to cut it later on. You'll be setting yourself up for misunderstanding some of the later and more advanced readings.